Hello and welcome to the Humble History channel. Today's video is about the worst times to be alive in human history. Number 10. 16th and 17th century anti-Catholicism in Britain. Due to religious tension caused by Protestants, if you were suspected of being a Catholic or harboring one, there were a number of creatively horrifying ways you could die. One woman was slowly and publicly crushed to death simply for refusing to talk when she was questioned for supporting the Catholics. You could be drawn and quartered, hung, or just lynched by a mob. The mob was rare, as the central authorities made sure to intervene and kill you themselves before the situation got so out of hand. Number 9. 1992 to 1996. The Siege of Sarajevo. One particularly horrifying siege that isn't mentioned that often is the Siege of Sarajevo by the Serbs, which is also the longest siege of a capital city in modern history. It went on for almost 4 years, and close to 14,000 people ended up dying. If the incessant shelling on primarily civilian areas, like the market, didn't get you, you could die in many other ways. People were dying just from the harsh cold as there were no fuel supplies in many parts of the city, and many people were killed by the snipers, who deliberately targeted children and teenagers. Number 8. 1918–1919, the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu at its peak infected around 1/3 of the entire human population, and total casualties are somewhere in the region of 20 million to 50 million. All of those may just sound like numbers, though imagine the odds of your body not slowly rotting off being as low as 1 in 3. It was a public health nightmare around the world, and anyone alive back then would have seen bodies lying around the street like it's nothing. Some say the disease ended in the spring of 1919. While others believe it continued to claim victims through 1920. Eventually, however, this deadly strain of the flu disappeared and humanity breathed a sigh of relief. Number 7. 1983 to 2009, Sri Lankan Civil War. A major problem fueling the conflict was sectarianism, as the majority Sinhalese government forces were regularly committing atrocities on the Tamil population. The most horrifying part of the war was around its end, when tens of thousands of civilians were sandwiched between approaching government forces and rebels, who had been using them as a buffer. Many civilians were massacred in the oncoming artillery barrage, though only if they weren't already killed in the earlier military-aided pogroms across the country. The war remains a forgotten yet brutal part of Sri Lanka's history. Number 6. 17th century, the 30 Years' War. War has been a part of European history for a long time, though few of those were as devastating for the people of Europe as the 30 Years' War. If we consider the proportion of the casualties to Europe's total population, it was far deadlier than events like the Black Plague or the Second World War. Around 8 million people were killed, making it one of the most lethal events in history. It was the focal point of the larger Catholics, Protestant conflict in Europe at the time, and absolutely devastated the countryside throughout Europe. Number 5. 1942, firebombing raids during World War II. While it's the nukes that get the most coverage, the firebombing raids of Tokyo are still known as the bloodiest bombing raid in military history, and possibly killed many more than both the nukes combined. Military-grade incendiary material, like napalm and petroleum jelly, was indiscriminately used on civilian areas, especially civilian areas, actually. For anyone living in Tokyo, or Dresden to a lesser extent, it would have been a scene right out of a horror movie. Charred remains of people on the streets, wooden houses set on fire in every direction, and the sound of bombers continuously prowling the air. As many as 100,000 civilians were burnt to death in just one night of bombing, with over 1 million maimed. This truly must have been a horrifying experience. Number 4. 1947, the Partition of India. Many modern world issues exist because the Brits decided to have fun with their borders before leaving their colonies, making things even more complicated for the independent countries. Nowhere is that more visible than in the partition of India into the countries of India and Pakistan on religious lines. Overnight, millions of people embarked on one of the biggest and most perilous mass migrations in history. That is, of course, if they could leave at all. Many of the Muslims in India, and conversely Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan, weren't that lucky. Around 1 million died in the ensuing riots that included horrors like literal trains full of dead bodies. They were one of the bloodiest riots in history, and true numbers of the casualties would probably never be known due to lack of records. Number 3. Roman slave miner. If you're looking for having the worst time of your life in Roman times, you could opt for being a slave in the mines. Reserved for the slaves the Romans particularly hated, it was just about the worst thing that could happen to you. The working conditions were horrible, and whoever was sent to the mines was expected to die there. There was rampant disease and deaths due to the harsh conditions, as mining wasn't the most developed technology back then. Mind you, this is not an exclusive punishment. You could also be mutilated and beaten for no reason, or just thrown into a pit with a wild animal purely for the guards' entertainment. Number 2. 1467 to 1600, the Sengoku period. For someone living in that period, war and suffering would have been a part of daily life. Apart from opposing factions regularly raiding villages and towns for supplies, civilians were often caught between battles they had nothing to do with. Of course, that wasn't the case in every village across Japan, as many of them thrived due to the shifting landscape. For those caught between the battles or the just lost in vast swathes of ungoverned Japanese terrain, it was a dangerous time to be in. The period was noteworthy for its brutality and general disregard for human life, and gave way to some of the most fearsome samurai warriors in Japanese history. Before we get to number 1, please don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe to The Humble Historian for more great content. Thank you. Number 1. The year 536. When it comes to scientists, they don't bother with guesses or estimates, and have calculated the exact year it was the worst time to be alive in history, the year 536. Apart from the falling empires the world over and general political chaos, the year 536 also marked one of the worst global famines in human history. The famine was due to ash in the air blocking the sunlight, which isn't surprising as there were also quite a few humongous volcanic eruptions around that time for good measure. The foggy eclipse of the sun, as it was described then, was visible everywhere in the world, giving the whole thing an even creepier vibe. Combine that with brutal conflicts in many places around the world, and you know why the researchers chose the year 536 to be the absolute worst one in history. Thank you for watching The Humble Historian. Which time in history did you least like and why? Comment your answers down below.